In a statement on Saturday, the MKMVA said it was unlikely that former President Jacob Zuma will get a fair trial in South Africa. Joining us now from our studios in Durban is ANC National Executive Committee member and MKMVA National Spokesperson Carl Niehaus. Good evening, Carl, and thank you very much for joining us on SABC News. Now, what are the reasons behind the MKMVA's unhappiness with the NPA's decision to charge former President Zuma?
Well, let me first of all say that we did not criticize the legal system in South Africa. In fact, we agreed with our mother body that the courts and the legal system in South Africa indeed is of exemplary quality. But what we did raise was a concern about whether it would be possible for former President Zuma to get a free and fair trial in South Africa because of the absolute avalanche of negative publicity and character assassination that had taken place against him over many, many years. And I think it is simply reasonable to say that every South African, and that would include every judge in South Africa, no doubt had been influenced by this kind of negative character assassination. And that raises a very serious question. Will it be possible for former President Zuma to get a free and fair trial in South Africa? And the simple question, but I believe a very important question, that MKMVA raised was that the courts and the judicial system will have to face this head on and deal with this issue, because this will be the most critical question in this whole run-up to the trial that is now pending.
Now, Carl, what in your view would constitute a fair trial for Zuma?
Well, obviously, a fair trial would be one where President Zuma can state his case and where the issues that have been raised are not contaminated by particular positioning and political intentions. Now, unfortunately, in the past, this particular issue around the trial and around the charges that had been brought against former President Zuma had been politicized. So there is the concern about the political component of it. And then, as I've stated to you, there's the concern about the general perceptions that had been created by very deliberate negative reporting about him. So both these issues will have to be addressed if the former president, can indeed hope to have a fair trial. And the concern that we raised is that we seriously doubt whether, under the circumstances of how this came about, the former political intervention and meddling, and now also this absolute problem, this absolute avalanche of negative publicity that had been brought against former President Zuma, we fear that it would be impossible to address these issues and indeed provide him with a fair trial. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't believe that the judiciary system in South Africa is of good quality. It just means that we are faced with what we believe is an almost insurmountable problem.
Now, your statement may be seen almost as an attack of the country's judicial system, which the ANC as the ruling party is supposed to protect. And I know you've mentioned that you're saying that you understand that there's nothing wrong with the judicial system necessarily, and it's almost the perceptions around the president. But what makes him different, considering there have been other people who've had negative perceptions around them? What makes him different, and why should he be treated differently?
Well, I don't think there's anyone in South Africa who had been given the kind of negative treatment that former President Zuma had received. And you know, we've seen it again yesterday with the absolute ridiculous behavior of the leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane, who went there outside the offices of the National Prosecuting Authority, clowning with champagne bottles, celebrating even just the charges being brought against President Zuma. Now, this, for us, seems to be a lynch mob. And a lynch mob doesn't provide proper justice. So what we have to face in South Africa is this negative avalanche against former President Zuma. And of course, we agree with what our mother body, the African National Congress, said, that the courts and the NPA should be given the space to proceed with this case in a fair and in an objective manner. But it is indeed, I believe, going to be very difficult to have a fair and objective approach to this when you have behaviors such as that of Mr. Mmusi Maimane and many other people, and also the mainstream white monopoly capitalist media in South Africa, who seem to be hell-bent on destroying President Zuma with anything and whatever is possible without them being prepared and able to wait for a proper trial. What we have seen in the media over the years was nothing else but a kangaroo court against former President Zuma.
Now, Carl, just to wrap up, President Zuma, even before he stepped down, did say that he'd like to have his day in court. Why not just let it go and give him the opportunity to have the day in court that he said he wants, so that he can be cleared, because he says he's not guilty?
Well, I fully appreciate that President Zuma has consistently said that he wanted his day in court. And of course, there is nothing wrong with him getting his day in court, as long as that day will indeed be fair, and as long as that day is not influenced by the kind of negative media and negative perceptions that I've just referred to. We must remember, and unfortunately in South Africa we don't seem to remember it, every citizen, including former President Zuma, has the right to be considered that that person is not guilty of a crime until and if so found guilty by a court of law.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Carl. Thank you very much for joining us. That was MKMVA National Spokesperson Carl Niehaus. Now, the Democrats